DigitalJamSessions.com. Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. This week we're joined once again by Phil from Big Point, who's returning to us once again. And we also have with us Andrew from Prospect Games. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Hello.
So, as always, we like to find out a little bit more about you and what you're up to. Now, for the benefit of our audience who don't know you yet, Andrew, would you care to explain a little bit more about Prospect Games and what you do up in the wild north of England?
Yeah, we are based in sunny Eccles, which, yes, is where the cake came from. And I'm the managing director of Prospect Games. We are a small team that have just released a 3D platform called Unbox Newbie's Adventure. It's a game about sentient, self-delivering cardboard boxes. So from that, you can tell that we like to make silly, wacky, creative ideas, and that's our goal in life.
It's a good goal in life. Phil, why don't you remind our lovely listeners exactly what you do over at Big Point and all that wonderful storytelling?
Right, so my name's Phil Harris. I'm Senior Narrative Designer at Big Point in Hamburg. I write for two of their substantially older products, Seafight and Dark Orbit. And I'm also working with our new owners, Yuzu, who are a Chinese-based company, on a number of their products. All in all, I also do, I'm also just about to release Kickstarter for a comic book, and I'm also finishing off my book of short stories.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. And it's also worth mentioning, Phil, that you are an alumni of the VR Writers' Room. Not that we're promoting the VR Writers' Room right now.
No, but almost everybody I talk to always gets sent a copy of the VR Writers' Room.
Okay, and on that note, why don't we talk a little bit here about narrative design and VR? Because I think this is a very prevalent topic, given exactly what you gentlemen are both up to. But I'm curious to start off actually with you, Andrew, in terms of where you came from with your sentient boxes and the story behind sentient boxes. That's the thing that we need to talk about, first of all. But second of all, I am kind of curious in terms of your narrative design process for the game and kind of how you approach that. Would you care to explain a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, the story from Unbox, I mean, in terms of our narrative design, I'd say awful. Like, we've been absolutely terrible at it, because the game came from a game jam, and out of that, we pivoted our business. So we were going to do a sci-fi racer game. We do a game jam where the theme's what's in the box. We come up with Unbox, which is all about cardboard boxes rolling around, racing against one another, trying to deliver post as quickly as possible. And so we kind of started with this incredibly bizarre set of gameplay mechanics and just started bolting on gameplay ideas around that. So it was very much a very long form evolution over the course of the game. So it started as, okay, well, they're boxes that are delivering post, so they probably work for a postal company. Then we had to come up with, well, what's the conflict? What's the interesting thing? From there, we came up with evil postal boxes that have gone rogue and hate postage and want to destroy this company. So it's like, okay, now we have cardboard boxes fighting over postage. And it just got wackier and weirder from that. And our influences like Super Mario and Banjo-Kazooie, all those kind of old school, very silly types of games, all of those sorts of narrative influences started impacting it as well. And we just kept adding and layering on more weird things. And then as we developed more mechanics and more options to engage with the narrative, so NPCs that you can talk to, signposts that you can read, little hidden Easter eggs, you can discover cutscenes. I mean, there's about 45, 50 minutes of cutscenes in the game that intro and outro every level and boss. It just gave us more opportunities to implement more of the narrative, but we were coming up with it as we went. So I'm actually surprised at how coherent the overall story is, considering how slapdash it was.
Okay, so here's the thing. First of all, I'm going to explain a few terms that you've thrown in there, because that was jargon jungle right there that you threw out. And I'm just really aware that some of our listeners may not be from the games industry. So we should probably give them context about what a game jam is to start off with, which is basically when a bunch of game designers and gamey type folks all decide to get together for anywhere between 24 to 48 hours and make stuff. And actually some really good games have come out of game jams, ironically enough. And then there was a couple of other things that you threw in there as well, Andrew, and I think it's worth kind of talking about what an NPC is, which is a non-player character. And also you mentioned cutscenes. So probably worth mentioning that cutscenes is basically a little cinematic video that you watch in between various bits of action in a computer game. So having explained all of that, and the fact that you've acknowledged that this was more of a organic kind of bolting on of different elements as you went, rather than a structured planning process. Phil, from your perspective, I'm sure you're sitting there kind of like tense and biting your fingernails as you're like, no, don't do this. Obviously, one of the fundamentals that we've talked about before in the past is this idea of a story Bible. And at the very least, having some kind of benchmark when it comes to the rules of the universe, the rules of the world in which you exist. Now, one thing that seems to be reasonably coherent here is that the team at Prospect have kind of stuck to those basic rules of the fact that, well, the boxes are sentient, clearly, and that they can move, and that, there are certain fundamental basics that they've stuck with, and those are consistent. But what would you advise for studios who are kind of going through this process? Because it isn't unusual for a studio to kind of do this, where they jump in head first, and then they're kind of backpedaling, if you like, when it comes to narrative and bolting things on as they go. What would be the kind of advice that you would give somebody who's having to kind of come at it from the back end rather than the front end?
I think one of the things that Andrew was saying, it actually holds with me very, very strongly. I think that when a product is like in that cohesion stage, when it's being built, all these things are like coming together, all the elements coming together. And I have a feeling that they had a better idea of the world. And then these things that he's talking about bolting on is just like how the world works. So in a way, they were creating a canon document, but they were building it directly into the game rather than writing it separately. Realistically, the most important thing is not to alienate anybody in the team when you're doing this. As a narrative designer, I'm regularly talking to not only the artists and the art team and the designers, but I'm talking to marketing, I'm talking to the coders, who are the programmers of the game. And we're all discussing how we make these elements come together, how we make them all flow together so that they all sort of like congeal into like the world that we're going to try and create. I've recently started saying I'm a bit like an anti-producer because I say, let's do all this amazing stuff and the world's like this and the sunsets are going to be glorious. And then what actually happens is the producer steps in and says, no, hang on a second, we've got only a certain amount of budgets to do this. But if you can just get those things together, there's actually a rule in like the games industry that if you try and add a monetization practice into a game too late in the process, the players will automatically be able to identify it. And I think it's the same with like narrative. If you try and like put narrative in late, then it really, really sometimes it grinds with the players. They can't see that they can really see that it's there. But Andrew's process, the process he was talking about for Unboxed, seems to have been very, very organic. And so I think the story will have naturally evolved with the game. So that's really good.
It actually kind of reminds me a little bit of I Am Bread with the guys over at Bossa, in as much as you're talking about sentient bread slices. So, some similarities there. But I do get the sense that it is very an organic process, that you're kind of putting it straight into game rather than putting it down in documentation. But the drawback of that, obviously, is that if you do have new people coming in as you grow as a studio, and I say that you, and I mean generalistically, this is not specific to Prospect, but we do find this a lot where you have these kind of mid-sized studios who are growing quite rapidly because of the success of the title. And then they have these new people come in and they kind of, the first thing they do when they walk in is like, okay, explain it to me. Tell me what's going on. And there isn't a document or there isn't a Bible that they can kind of point to and say, well, this is it. Instead, it becomes this very convoluted process trying to onboard people where it's literally you're having to do this information download from brain to brain rather than a central kind of depository of information, if that makes sense. And I am curious if this is one of those things that you might have already had the challenge of, Andrew, or if it's something that you're thinking about how to mitigate that going forwards.
Yeah, I think once we finished Unbox as a project, we had a very lengthy retrospective. I think the two biggest challenges and issues that we faced over the project was communication and just information storage. So despite the fact that most of the core team were all sat in the same room for 2 years straight, communication was regularly the main problem that we had, not letting people know what we were doing and what we were planning, or where we were planning on taking a certain mechanic or narrative element. And then similarly, so we were a very modular team on Unbox and plan to be so moving forwards, and that identified this issue of when you have over 100 people work on a game, which we did with Unbox, and most of them never step in the room, most of them aren't even in the same country. If you don't have a central repository where you're storing all that information, not only is it really hard for new people to plug in and do stuff, but if you lose anybody from that core team, you know, they move on, they get a new job, whatever, a large chunk of that knowledge goes with them, and it becomes that it's almost irreplaceable. You can't fill that in because the rest of us weren't thinking about those things that person was.
Yeah.
So that for future projects, it's absolutely become essential that from narrative to everything else, we design and document stuff from the get-go, with the caveat that it's going to change over the course of the game. We want to continue to be a developer that's organic with our design process. But if it's not being documented at every stage, it's going to be very hard to plug people in. And the second somebody leaves, all of that knowledge, all of that talent goes with it. There's zero transference from one narrative designer or one programmer leaving to the next person coming in. It's all gone. That's very bad for your business.
But aside from the fact that it is quite a challenge to deal with that, one of the other things that was kind of mentioned by both of you was this challenge around communication. And, you know, you said there, Andrew, about how you guys were kind of all in the same office, but at the same time, there wasn't really much communication going on. And Phil, I know that you've kind of said that you're working, you know, cross vertical in terms of with everybody in the team. And sure, you're a little bit anti-producer at the moment because they're normally the ones who kind of put a break on things and give some context. But I think traditionally within this process, there has always been a little bit of a divide between the creative and artistic elements of the studio versus the technical development end of the studio. And how do you bridge that gap between those two chasms, if you like, when it comes to making sure that everybody is on the same page and that you are maintaining that skill, that knowledge, and the experience that they've had within the context of the game title? I'm curious, Phil, from your perspective, how you approach something like that.
Take them for a beer. No, you probably want a more serious answer than that. So interestingly, I'm now sort of working with Yuzu in China, and I'm working on Yuzu products. And so we're doing all this by telecommunication and video conferencing. And this is going really, really well because the team in China feel the enthusiasm I'm putting forward. When I gave them the new worlds for these games, they got really, really excited about this. And it was feedback. And then we started talking to like different parts of the team. So I integrated some of the artists from our place into the process so that we could like build better products. And it's going really, really well. The amount of communication I have with Yuzu, I find them really, really easy to communicate with. My colleague across there, Dong, is absolutely brilliant. He's a master of English, to be honest, and I think we're turning into really, really good friends. But realistically, that's the fact, is you just have to involve everybody. You have to consider everything that you're doing. If I create a cup on a table and I want that cup to be moved, but I wanted that cup to be moved and then it has to fall over, I need to talk to the programmers about that. I need to get them involved in the process. I need to call them into a meeting. And a lot of times in the games industry, it seems to be too many meetings. Actually, I think meetings are usually too long. I try and cut mine down to sort of 15 or 30 minutes so that I can get the points across and then we can all leave and just have a breather rather than being stuck in a room together for an hour. But it is just a case that I'm a bit of a wildfire in Big Point. I go around and I make sure that I talk to everybody and I make sure I engage. So I think you need somebody within the team who is highly motivated and highly positive to do that type of thing. Now, taking on board what Andrew said, then I obviously become a problem as well, because like if I have all this knowledge, if I'm working on sort of 7 product within the Big Point and Yuzu stable, and then I disappear, then who's going to supply that knowledge? But I do like regular updates of like canon documents and things like this so that people can follow on. And there's another issue here as well, Tanya. It's one that I've just been speaking about recently at conferences, and this is about localization and making sure that if you like localizing your stuff, how are you communicating that across, and how are you making that clear to people? For the localization managers who I work with very, very closely, I'm now providing synopsis sheets for the translators, so the translators understand the exact meaning of the things that I'm saying. And if there's a sort of in-joke there or something like that, there was a quest in Dark Orbit called Indulge Decorum Est, which is based on the Wilfred Owen poem. And in my instructions, it said it should just be the name of this poem in your own specific language.
It's interesting that you bring this up, because I know that's a topic that Kate Edwards has also been speaking a lot about, this kind of thing in terms of culturalization as well as localization, because they're two different things, and oftentimes they get misconstrued or confused between the two things. And this idea that there is a lack of engaging with culturalization of product rather than localization of product, which is just straight translation, but understanding the cultural nuances of what you're doing when you're translating the game into that local language is also making those modifications, whether it's moral or whether it's a kind of an ethical thing within that territory, whether it's a particular social norm within that territory, that you're actually embedding those within the localization as well as the actual direct translation as well, which I think it is a bit of an issue, actually, especially when it comes to certain types of games where people just don't spend that much time on localization. They just kind of bang it out in a different language, and once they've done eFigs, they're kind of happy. One of the things that I wanted to kind of drill down into a little bit as well was this notion that once you've created these documentations, whether it's a Bible or book or whatever the thing may be, is actually the fact that especially when it's a big MMO, okay, and we're not going to name names here, but I think if I say this, you know exactly which title I'm talking about. But I do remember walking into one studio where it was an MMO, and to be fair, it was a big MMO title. I walked in and they literally gave me 4 ring binders, big A4 ring binders with 3 millennia worth of history that I literally had to get my brain around in the space of a week. And it's like, okay, I understand that you have this really rich universe that you want your players to understand, and there's been all this time and energy that's gone into this, but the players are only seeing like a fraction of this. Why do I have to now wrap my head around 4 millennia worth of history that, at least 3 of those millennia, nobody's ever going to hear about them? You may refer in random passing to an ancient historical character or place, but in general, most people aren't going to ever hear about this stuff. I'm kind of curious from your perspective, Phil, when you are putting together these Bibles, how much detail you're trying to get in there, and whether or not you feel that perhaps sometimes people are being too granular with the detail.
I'd hope I'm being granular with the detail. We use Confluence, and I've used Confluence a number of times because you can tag words in the conversations in the data, so that people can always quickly find reference points. I also tend to make sure that the first paragraph is a short paragraph, which makes the very, very simple description of what it's going to be. I add images that I feel are effective, or actual images from the game, if it comes into the game, onto that document, so people have a better idea of what I'm doing and what I'm trying to say. And if it's to do with characters or specific locations, I'll do a breakdown synopsis of the character. And going back to the localization thing, whether they speak formally or informally or semi-formally, what their four main traits are and things like this. And if those change, they'll change, and I'll also update to say which period they were acting in this way and which period they were acting in this way. So the very top bits of all this, all this canon, should be really, really easily accessible, so that people can drift from one to the next and pick things up. Because I'm never going to send the translators 8 millennia of stuff, because there's no real point in doing it. I need to just highlight the important stuff for the things that they're dealing with now. And that's exactly the same with the team. And if you were coming into Big Point and you were working with us on Sea Fight, for example, I would just say, this is the crux of Sea Fight. You want to read this first and then just like explore around it. But this is the most important thing. To be honest, we also have style guides as well. I have a narrative style guide and a localization style guide. And actually that would be your first point of call. So you'd get an idea of what the style was and what the very, very basic story of the game was.
I think I would have preferred to come and work there than being given formula URL. But
just because you want to work with me.
I'm just saying, it sounds a lot easier than the process I had to go through. But, Andrew, having said all of this, I'm kind of curious from the perspective of the game Unbox, and the fact that you as a studio, Prospect Games as a studio, are kind of focusing in on VR. This is an area of interest for you, obviously. I'm kind of curious in terms of, have you noticed any specific differences around the way that you would approach narrative design for immersive content?
Well, a lot of the VR work that we've done thus far, all of it's been kind of under wraps and has been client focused. And yeah, we found that, just the simple fact that people can look around and see various things, it's kind of a double-edged sword. So we had one experience that we were designing where you went from point to point and the user could choose which order they wanted to do that in. And so it was great because, okay, we can have things play out during those transition stages in a 360 manner all around them and tell stories as they're traveling from one area to another and then tell them another story there while they're engaging with the mechanics. But of course, it means that there's a whole bunch of, we found with VR, and this kind of summarizes it the best, like just the technical challenges, like trying to have an experience run as a higher FPS that you need for it, and wanting to do all these things. Like we're going so laden all of these transitions with so many things, people popping in and out, talking to, doing all this stuff, and it was incredibly resource intense. And then we were looking at trying to get it all to run on a Gear VR, and it was like, no, none of this.
Good luck.
Yeah, no, because nothing runs on a Gear VR. So yeah, that was the biggest thing, is kind of matching our wonder and creative desire with the technical constraints of these platforms.
Okay.
So while there's loads of stuff you could potentially do, you need to spend a lot of time doing VR stuff in order to figure out, like, how am I going to keep this running at 90 FPS stable while doing all the things that I want to do.
And when it comes to the types of more entertainment-led, so not talking about the kind of corporate experiences that you put together, but more kind of thinking more game-led or entertainment-led, I'm kind of curious from your perspective whether or not you feel that you should be doing content for the under 13s or not, because there's a bit of a debate going on at the moment, and this is all because of Dubbit, who've just launched their CVR report, which is Children in VR report, talking about the impact of VR on kids and how kids engage and interact when they're in the space and when they're utilizing this technology, and the fact that actually it's not this big bad scary thing that people think it is, because unlike TV, where people were quite happy with the technology to just say, hey, you know what, it's fine to put a kid in front of a TV. But with VR, people are already being very cautious about whether or not they should put children in VR. So I'm kind of curious from your perspective where you fall on this one, Andrew, in terms of to make content for young children or to not make content for young children. This is the question. Yeah,
so, Unbox is a product for the younger generations. It harkens back to old school games, so we do have a contingent of older people who play it, and the next game that we want to make is very much aimed at a younger market again. For me, this is more than a VR issue, because there's always been boogeymen. It was death metal and VHS tapes back in the day, and it was video games, and now we iPads and all that kind of stuff. And to me, across the board, it's always been a case of, well, it's not necessarily the medium that's the problem, but we have to accept and admit, and I very much have personal experience with this, that all things digital and media orientated can be extremely addictive. And I grew up with things like Xbox Live and the rise of the internet. I was riding that wave, and I've struggled for years with overindulging in these forms of content. And I think that what people, and I don't know if it's justified or not, but you see that there's this quite a wide-scale problem of people being addicted to their phones or addicted to the internet or addicted to games. Like, it is a thing that I think in the games industry we don't really talk much about. Well, and again, not on the scale that you would. Again, because I've experienced this very personally, it's a topic that I hold very dear to my heart, and I just don't see that many people talking about it to the scale that I thought they would. And I think the apprehension people have is that if you already have a lot of people addicted to these forms of content, if you put them in VR, it's going to be like Matrix, where they lose all sense of time and space and what reality is. Now, I don't think that's going to happen. But I do think we just have culturally a wider problem of every second of the day there is a screen in front of you or near you providing infinite amounts of content. And VR is just going to be the next stepping stone in that. When there is an explosion of content in VR, when it's TV, films, games, whatever, that just adds to a growing problem of we have a lot of people who can't disconnect.
It's interesting that you say this, though, because in terms of like the whole addiction to digital and addiction to gaming, and the fact that nobody really talks about it, it's kind of ironic in many ways, given that for most people in the games industry who work on the commercial side of the fence, that's actually what their job is to make the game as addictable as possible. And we don't use that word, but we want people to get hooked. We want people...
retention.
Yeah.
Engagement.
We use lots of other words, but ultimately, we're trying to get people hooked. We're trying to get them addicted to repetitive play, to come back and keep on investing their time, keep on investing of themselves within that product. So in some ways, it's kind of... I understand why people don't talk about it, just because it is such a fundamental part of what they do. But what I want to do is I kind of want to come back to this topic of the idea that we're surrounded by screens, we're surrounded by technology, and that actually VR is just the next technology that everybody's going to whine about. But it does bring me back to a statement that was made earlier on today, actually, at a conference where there was a panel. And one of the kind of things that we were talking about was this notion that there does seem to be a bit of a misconception of perception when it comes to how people are going to engage with VR technology. And I just want to kind of make sure that we've set the record straight on this, because I don't think that people are thinking about this logically, in as much as we all have screens in our lives. Yes, we all have a mobile phone, but we're not permanently looking at our mobile phone because we have to do other things in the day. So when we look at the devices and the relationships we have with devices, we have organic relationships with devices at different times of the day, depending on what it is we need to do. So in the morning, we're on our mobile phone, checking our emails. We commute, we play some games on our mobile phone. We get to work, we sit down and we're at a PC. Now we're in a monitor and we're doing emails and things like that. And then maybe, in the evening, we might watch a movie on a tablet, or we might watch a TV, or we might go to the cinema and watch something on a theatre screen. But we organically transition between different screens. In the same way with VR, VR is not one of these things that somebody's going to sit in it for 8 hours of the day. It's just not going to happen. And for some strange reason, there is this kind of attitude of, whether it's VR or AR headsets, that people are going to be like locked inside these HMDs for 8 hours a day, if not longer. And that's where this obsessive kind of negativity comes from, this idea that people are going to lose themselves in these immersive worlds and these immersive environments because they're going to spend all day, all of their lives inside these environments, which just frankly isn't true, because it's just not the way that we would A, design any experiences to last that long, but B, because it's not plausible in the way that we as human beings live our lives. We have organic relationships with the technology, and we utilize the technology as relevant to us at that point in the day. But Phil, I'm kind of curious to hear your stance on this, because I know that we've had this conversation before.
So are you telling me all the things that I learned from 1980s science fiction films are wrong?
Yeah.
Okay.
The Matrix is not going to eat you alive. I'm sorry, it's just not going to happen.
It's so one of my concerns is AR, actually, augmented reality, because I can see augmented reality taking off far faster than virtual reality, with people using glasses or things like this to be able to find their way around and things like this. And there's this sort of level of common sense which I see disappearing, because we're depending on the machines to do it. And then if the machines all switch off, where are we going to be there?
Yeah.
I don't really know. So I think that's an interesting way to look at it. It's quite interesting. I was recently at Worldcon in Helsinki, and Robert Silverberg was there, and he was talking about, we were on a genetics panel, and he was talking about the fact that in 60 years, with genetic modification, he was concerned. He didn't say concerned, but it was clear that he was concerned that he might not be able to recognize anybody particularly as human by that point. But that's evolution, and we've got to go through it. We've got to adapt to the systems that we see as being most useful to us. So if VR is useful for entertainment, then I don't see the problem with VR. And to go back to the question about children, I don't see the problem of children using VR. I just see it's all to do with the censorship standards, which is such a long conversation. I'm not even going to go into it.
That's a whole other podcast. That's a whole other podcast.
Yeah, it is a whole other podcast, but please invite me. But I think the really, really important thing for me is the fact that we use those devices, but we also do something beyond that. We have to use them. We have to find out the reason. There is an addictive nature to mobile devices. There is an addictive nature to knowing everything that's going on. There's an addictive nature to the complete suppression of privacy that sometimes people feel, and that's I think why they sort of cry out. There's been research and reports on Facebook and the fact that a lot of people on Facebook aren't actually very happy because all they see is other people posting things about how great their life is, but that doesn't actually mean those people are happy either. They're just trying to, it's a sort of one-upmanship game.
Well, it's a curated form of life. It's not even real. It's very curated.
Yes, exactly. So if we can get out of that system, if we can utilize these systems for what they're really, really good for. So if we can use VR for appreciating art, for going around, for seeing all these things, for going and talking to people, for allowing the disabled to go and visit places they wouldn't be able to visit because of their disabilities. These people who can't actually leave a room because they're so scared of the outside, maybe VR can be used to sort of breach that. Maybe that's the first step for them being able to identify and deal with things. I mean, I've spent a lot of time in my life working in welfare rights and dealing with people with mental health issues. And so I understand some of the problems that they really, really are expressing. So I think virtual reality, it's how we use the tool. I think back when cinema was originally sort of created, it was sort of the mark of the demon, and it's just and VR is sort of coming through that. But I think a lot of it is because of those movies from the 80s. I think that a lot of people have seen those, and these are the people who are sort of speaking about it and seeing it. And there's a lot of people who are uneducated and haven't really tried it, who then go and speak about it without actually knowing the full details of what's going on. So we're in this juncture at the moment where we have people who don't have the knowledge of it who are free to speak about it, and people who do have the knowledge who are speaking about it. And we need a few more evangelists, and we need a few more evangelists speaking about it in the right way, not just giving a whole lot of data and blurb. But actually sort of engaging with it in a really, really good way.
It's interesting that you say this, because somebody was commenting earlier on today actually about an instance where Richard Attenborough was on a panel, or he was at an event where he was talking about some of the VR pieces that have recently done, where he is narrating over things like a deep sea, exploration 360 and, trips to the Galapagos Islands and all this other stuff. And somebody asked a question in the audience, which was, by doing these kind of 360 experiences, aren't we just losing connection with real life and with humanity? And why would we do this when I could just go there myself and just physically do it and see it myself? And so Richard's response was actually brilliant, because he turned around and he said, yes, you could absolutely physically go to these places, but the fact is you shouldn't. These places are endangered. They are at risk because of human interaction. And you shouldn't be going there in the first place. And it was a brilliant response. Because when you think about it, that's really the power and the benefit of something like VR, is actually allowing and facilitating for things that actually we as society perhaps shouldn't be doing certain things. And it would be nice if we just left well enough alone. So instead of going to Greenland or going to Iceland and polluting the atmosphere by taking the plane that we need to take to get there in the first place, and then all the other things that happen as a result of that, wouldn't it be nice if we just sat at home and saw it on a HMD instead? But I also kind of want to pick up on some of the other things that you were saying as well, Phil, because I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff that you were talking about. But I am kind of when you talk about this idea of this lack of sense that happens when people are in immersive environments, especially in AR, I point back to the Pokemon Go phenomenon of people randomly walking into the middle of a road or into the middle of a lake or off a cliff, and random silly things that you would never think to do that if it was normal life and you weren't engaged and focused on this mobile phone, looking through the mobile phone as the window into your life to be able to see your Pokemon flopping about so that you can go and pick them up. But I do wonder if there isn't a certain degree of accountability and responsibility that is for the individual rather than for the developer. Because I do feel like the developers got a lot of flack for the fact that people just weren't applying basic common sense. I mean, it stands to reason if you're, about to cross the road and there's a lot of cars coming back and forth, just because you see a particular Pokemon on the other side of the street is not reason to go charging across the street and potentially get hit by a car. But yet it becomes the developer's responsibility to ensure that they're thinking of every last possibility of how somebody could be really stupid. And I am curious, I open this out to both of you, as to whether or not you feel that perhaps there is too much expectation when it comes to just anticipating human stupidity. Whether or not you think perhaps there's just too much expectation on developers for this stuff, especially when it comes to immersive technologies. And I'll throw this one at you first, Andrew.
Yeah, well, I mean, when I was a kid and Pokemon cards were all the rage, I remember my friend got a shiny Charizard. He was over the road and he ran over to me to show it off and ran straight out in front of a car and very closely was almost hit. So, I mean, it's one of these things where it's like, okay, you're going to go to Nintendo and say you shouldn't make Pokemon cards so exciting to stop children running over the road. So, yeah, there's definitely an element of like, it doesn't matter what the medium is, there's always going to be people doing daft stuff. It does, I think it increases when you have something that can not only be interactive, but, next step of AR is wearables. And if your entire vision is taken up with shiny Charizards, then there's probably going to be an uptake in people doing stupid stuff. But again, it's one of these things where you can design around that. And on the flip side, until you do something, you don't know how users are going to react to it. So, you mentioned before that we're not going to design VR activities to be super addicting and stuff that people spend ages doing. But and it's a case of what if some people do? And how do we get around that? How do we stop people doing stuff like that? But we'll only know when you make a product. I mean, you make something, people try it out. Some people like it, some people hate it. And a lot of people do stuff you never, ever envision them doing. And that's the story of every product that's ever existed. People do weird stuff. And I think it's less important for developers and businesses to be thinking of every single possible paradigm that a product could end up finding itself in, and more important to react to how people use it, to analyze that data and go, how can we make this product safer, better, less addictive, more addictive, whatever it is that thing needs, and try lessen people walking out into the roads as a result of that.
Okay, Phil, what's your take on this?
I blame marketing. No, I don't really. I think that it's a real sort of case that it's survival of the fittest. It really, really is. You really can't ask a game. If a game says at the start of the game, this is, please don't play this game when you're doing this or doing this. It's a bit like taking medication. If you take medication that says don't operate heavy machinery while you're using this medication, then more fool you if you operate heavy machinery while taking this medication. If it endangers other people, that's where I have a problem with it. But again, that's to do with the person, and it's not to do with the developers. Andrew's completely right. It's just you can't start looking at every edge case. I mean, within the games industry at this point in time, where we're building a game, we're looking at edge cases. And to explain to the listeners, edge cases are sort of cases you don't expect to happen, but if this happened in the game, what would happen in the game? But it's a case of edge casing for people, and people just have to use their common sense. We're probably going to be in a position prediction, probably before I go, that most of like the traffic on the roads is going to be automated, and it is going to be automatically sort of trying to avoid stupid people wandering around trying to catch the latest craze. But it still is the fact that a cliff is a cliff, and a panther is a panther. So you don't go into a cage with a panther to like have a play with it unless you've got chainmail goddamn gloves on, so that the panther can't take a nice bite out of you. This is and this, I really like the Richard Attenborough thing, because I agree with it as well. There is this whole thing of like, yes, the reason that we're producing these things is so you don't have to go and like ruin things. I know that the famous temple in Cambodia, I've just forgotten the name of it. One of my friends said, I can't see that lasting more than another 100 years with all the tourists going across it, touching it, and like they're doing this thing. We seem to have this a massive sense that we need to get in touch with the past, and yet we don't actually research what that past was about and actually gain any proper knowledge from it. And touching things and actually gaining knowledge from things. This is why I'm always so about research in narrative and in anything. Just research the things, but also like research your own like actions and what you're doing when you're integrating with a game or an interactive experience of any type. Because it's like people using like mobile phones in the cinema. If I could shoot them all, I would. because with a tranquilizer dart or something, I'm not going to go like rampaging through cinemas because they're really it pisses me off, to be honest. It's just like they have no consideration for the people around them, and I think this is the problem. People need to get back to having consideration to the people around them.
Okay, interesting. In terms of, I now know to not go anywhere near a cinema that you're about to go into, just in case somebody uses a mobile phone. Could get very violent. But what I wanted to kind of wrap up with really was this kind of idea of what it is that you think is going to shift things, be it a cultural or a technological shift. And I want to give an example of this because I am a big fan of technology, as you all know. And yes, by the way, I don't have a driver's license because I refuse to learn how to drive, because I believe in my lifetime we will have fully autonomous vehicles and I will never need to learn how to drive. That's just me being stubborn. But as an example, I have a lot of wearable technology, and of the wearable technology that I have all sorts of stuff that connects to apps, that connects to my mobile phone, that warns me about things or shows me stuff or keeps track of things or whatever the heck it's going to do. But of all the technology that I have, the one piece that I'm still using over a year after I got it is the Curve ring, which is basically a contactless payment ring. That's all it is. It's a little chip inside the ring. Doesn't have to charge. It doesn't have to be connected to a mobile phone app. It doesn't do anything else other than make payments. And yet it is still the thing that I use every single day, which is, I think it's interesting when you think about the amount of energy and the amount of time that's gone into these very complex apps and other types of wearables that are tracking health and steps and warning me when somebody's trying to contact me or whatever the other things are that these things do. But they invariably fall by the wayside within 3 to 6 months, easily. And yet the simplest piece, the most straightforward piece of technology is the one that I use every single day. And so I'm kind of curious, from your perspective, what is it you think that is going to be the simple, streamlined thing that will change behaviors, change attitudes towards VR and gaming? And I'm going to throw this one at you first, Phil, because you've been on the show before.
For me, it's augmented reality. I mentioned it before. I think in 5 years' time, pretty much everybody will have glasses with some augmented reality function within the first world, and probably quite a lot of the second world. The third world will obviously be a situation where it is always playing catch up because of the nature of things. I think it will become such a useful tool to people to be able to do this, yet again, giving them oodles and oodles of information that they probably don't need to do things. It will also completely ruin pub quizzes. It's just that, it's that step between. it's that step from life to using some type of like reality enhancing like system to going to virtual reality. At this point in time, I think virtual reality is really on the cusp of the early stages. I think it's on Montgolfier's like Flight to the Moon, if we put it in cinema terms. And I think it's got a long way to go. I think video games have come along but a lot further, and other interactive experiences. But I think augmented reality, when it gets out there into the mainstream, and it will, is going to be that step between where people get so used to wearing goggles or glasses that then putting on a VR headset doesn't feel like a challenge.
Okay. Andrew, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I think two of the most important factors for all of this is battery life and weight. So if you look at something like an example from way back in the day when I started gaming, you have the Sega Game Gear and the Game Boy. And it's like, why did the Game Boy, with a far worse looking screen and far less in terms of the way performance power, do better? And it wasn't really a cost issue. It was the fact that you could put batteries in it and it would last for ages, and it was much smaller and easy to carry around. And it's the same where, with things like your smartphones and your mobile phones, that technology existed for years prior. It became mainstream popular, so much content built around that, because they suddenly became incredibly easy to carry around. They last, 5, 10, 15 hours. And I think looking at VR, like, what's the main thing that's holding people back? And it isn't really the cost. It's the fact that there's these giant clunky things that you've got to use. There was I don't know if you've heard of Meta. They do a
Indeed.
AR headset.
Yeah.
They have a really cool promo video. It shows off all the technology brilliantly.
But the size of that thing on your head, oh my gosh.
Yeah, there's a shot of some girls at a slumber party and they're all wearing them and playing some game together. And it's like,
no, they're not not playing anything with that thing on their head. They're basically not able to move their head.
Now, if it was, like Mass Effect, where it's just holograms appearing on your face and it's the exact same experience, those girls will be doing that. I'll be doing that. And so I think, it's a pretty generic answer. And technology needs to progress, but I think very specifically, performance is less of an issue. We can already do pretty crazy cool things. We've got the processing power to make entire game worlds and put them in VR. It's that these things need to be lighter and easier to carry around, and I need to be able to not worry about recharging every 2 minutes or having a cable sticking out the back of my head for this stuff to really take off.
It's interesting you say this. I'm just going to throw this out here as a curveball, and Phil, you can choose to agree with me or disagree with me on this one. But I'm kind of looking forward to when we don't have HMDs. I'm kind of looking forward to when somebody figures out contact lens stuff. But when we get to a stage where, for example, we're taking advantage of the other technologies that are flying around at the moment. And the one that seems obvious here is like smart pills. So the idea that you can swallow a smart pill and it goes into your system, and doctors and healthcare professionals can track things because the pill itself is powered by the body. So it's powered by your stomach acids and your stomach fluids once you've swallowed the pill. So it'll actually be operating and functional for the entirety of your life. It'll always be operating because it's always going to be powered. There has to be some interesting way that we can power this technology without it being this big ass clunky thing on your head, and into something that's a little bit more integrated with the body and a little bit closer to the body. So whether that's contact lenses in combination with some of the powering system like smart pill or whatever the thing may be, I'm kind of curious to see where we go with this, because I do think that for as long as it remains the HMD, as long as it remains this physical thing on the head, I don't think we're going to get to that point of mainstream that people are anticipating or hoping for. But Phil, you can feel free to disagree with me on this.
I know a number of people who have problems putting contact lenses in, so that's that would be an interesting one. It's an interesting one. I think that it depends what becomes the standard.
Yeah.
And that depends very much on companies. In about 20 years ago, I'd say that depends very much on governments, but I don't think governments count in this equation anymore. I think it depends very, very much on companies and which way companies decide to go. If sort of Google was to create a super cheap version, I mean, like Google Cardboard was a super cheap version of like VR, basically. If they produced something like that for like glasses, then I could see that sort of taking off just because they were super cheap. And it's all about, it's just getting people commonly using them. As soon as you find a good use for something, then you're more likely to use it again and again and again and again. It's like a great recipe. Once you have a good recipe, you always want to cook it again. And it's sort of usually it becomes the dish that you're like known for, or two or three of them become the dishes you're known for. And I think it's that. I agree very much with Andrew about like battery size and like length of time. This a really, really essential thing. But I think that powering off the body is not a problem. I think people's main fear, and this goes back to another question, is that they think that something's going to be injected into their body, and that the smart pills are a really, really cool like idea. And I can see people understanding it and going, oh yeah, I can see this being a really, really positive thing to do. But as soon as it involves not swallowing something, but as soon as it involves some type of operation on the person to make a modification so that they can like sense this, or it can like feed off the body's power, I think that's where you're going to get that wall block for quite a long time of people going, I'm not going to do this. And that's why I think that the things like the glasses are going to be, the HMDs are going to be the mainstay for a while.
It's interesting because this goes back to your thing with the 1980s movies thing. And I know that I've said this before, but I'm going to say it again for the benefit of our listeners, which is that there is this attitude towards technology that was perpetuated back in the 1980s with all those movies where technology was the evil bad guy, and you know, having any kind of technology was always going to be doom and the end of the world. And that there is a certain degree of fear. With technology, it's fine when the technology is on the surface of the body. It becomes an issue when the technology is inserted into the body. And that's when people start to have a fear. They inherently have a fear, even though, you know, we have pacemakers, we have, you know, all sorts of different types of technology that already do get inserted into the body. But there is this common perception of technology being integrated into biological systems as being bad and being negative. And I wonder whether or not there will be a shift in attitude towards that over the next decade or two, but we shall see. But in the meantime, as always, it's been wonderful to have you on the show, but we'd like to give our listeners a way to find out a little bit more about what you're up to. We ask you to do this by sharing with us your social media handle of choice. Would you care to share with us what that is, Andrew?
Sure, mine is ANBENNISON, so just A.N. Benison. If they want to follow our games making, it's just at Prospect Games.
And that's on Twitter, yes?
Yep, that's both on Twitter.
Wonderful. And Phil, what about your good self?
I'm on Twitter at Philip G. Harris, all one word, Philip spelled with one L. Always really happy to like talk to people about views and things like this. If you add me, I tend to add you back unless you look like a bot. So yeah, happy to talk.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for joining us and thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to subscribe and review and follow us on Twitter at Digital Jam Ltd. Thinking of launching your own podcast? Speak to the GL Pro UK team who handle all of our podcast service needs. Tell them that Digital Jam Session sent you and you'll get 10% off your first order. Find out more at www.glpro.co.uk. digitaljamsessions.com